Imagine this. You're sitting across from someone, maybe a therapist, maybe a lover, and they ask you, "What was your childhood like?" You smile politely. "It was fine," you say. "I had everything I needed. My parents worked hard, they didn't hit me. I was lucky." You believe it too. And yet, for reasons you cannot articulate, you feel hollow in moments that should be joyful, abandoned even when surrounded by people, and strangely undeserving of love that comes freely. Now imagine that what hurt you most growing up wasn't something that was done, but something that never happened. Not abuse, not violence, but absence. The kind of absence you can't point to because it leaves no scars. The absence of attunement, of curiosity, of emotional presence, of being truly seen. How can you miss something you never had? How can you mourn a version of yourself that never got to exist? And here's the deeper paradox. What if your greatest pain is invisible not just to others, but to you? What if you've spent your entire adult life compensating for a wound you don't even believe is real? Is it possible that the self you think you are is merely a survival structure? And if so, who would you be without it? The path to your true self may begin not with what happened, but with what didn't. And that question will take us deeper than most dare to go. Emotional neglect is an absence, a silence that echoes across a lifetime. And because it leaves no bruises or broken bones, the world rarely acknowledges its existence. But just because something is invisible does not mean it is harmless. In fact, it may be the most insidious form of harm, because it teaches a child to deny their very need for connection, for recognition, for emotional presence. It teaches them to erase themselves before the world ever gets the chance to. The child learns early, needs are too loud, emotions are inconvenient, being noticed is dangerous. So like a good survivor, they adapt. They become helpful, quiet, smart, responsible. They make themselves easy to love by becoming easy to ignore. And this mask, this performance of adequacy, becomes mistaken for identity. Alain de Botton once said, "We are not merely the people we are also the people we were never allowed to be." That unspoken tragedy lives beneath the surface of emotional neglect. It doesn't scream, it whispers, it doesn't scar, it silences. Psychologically, this is the soil in which the false self blooms. Donald Winnicott, a psychoanalyst, first introduced the idea of the false self, a persona constructed to please others, to manage expectations, to avoid abandonment. Carl Jung would call this the persona, the mask we wear to navigate society. The tragedy begins when we forget that it is a mask. And what happens to the real self, the one with wild emotions, contradictory desires, and messy truths? It is banished to the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the rejected parts of ourselves, the aspects we disown because they were never welcomed in the first place. But they do not disappear. They wait, they sabotage, they cry out through addiction, anxiety, rage, or numbness. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." In a world where we are not seen, we often learn to become the observer of our own pain, detached, ironic, invulnerable. But this detachment is not strength, it is a scar. The neglected child grows into an adult who can achieve, impress, seduce, and serve, yet feels fundamentally disconnected from those they love. Relationships feel performative, success feels hollow. And when loneliness creeps in, they don't know if it's because they're too much or not enough. They live suspended in a paradox, outwardly functional, inwardly fractured. Society rewards this fracture. Our culture glorifies emotional independence, stoicism, and the suppression of need. Don't be needy becomes a badge of honor. But what if neediness isn't weakness? What if it's just the residue of everything you had to bury in childhood to survive? Arthur Schopenhauer believed that human suffering arises not from what we lack, but from what we long for and cannot name. Emotional neglect is exactly that, a hunger for something we were trained to believe we didn't deserve, and so we live with a ghost hunger. We search for completion in careers, lovers, gurus, and goals, only to be met with a dull emptiness because the wound is not external. The false self becomes the social self. The shadow becomes the scapegoat. The real self is hidden under layers of adaptation, compliance, and fear. But here's the cruel twist. If no one ever named your pain, you might spend your entire life invalidating it yourself. You might call it just how I am. You might pathologize your sensitivity. You might celebrate your independence, not realizing it's rooted in abandonment. And this is where the philosophical crisis begins. Because if your sense of self was shaped by what was missing, who are you really? Can a self constructed around absence ever become whole? The question isn't just psychological, it is existential. It demands that we peel back everything we've used to survive and ask, what part of me has never been given permission to exist? That's the part we must now turn toward, not to fix it, but to meet it. Finally. There are wounds that scream, and then there are wounds that echo. Emotional neglect belongs to the second kind, a quiet force that reverberates through adulthood, not with violence, but with confusion. The child who grew up without emotional presence does not become an obviously broken adult. Instead, they become functional. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous thing of all. They know how to meet deadlines, how to nod at the right times in conversations, how to smile in photos and say, "I'm fine." But beneath the performance, something is missing. A stable sense of identity, rooted not in what they do, but in who they are. Their adult life becomes a carefully choreographed response to everyone else's expectations, because their inner compass was never built. The consequences hide in plain sight. They show up in your relationships. You fall in love with people who don't know how to see you, because being unseen feels familiar, safe even. You tolerate coldness, inconsistency, emotional distance, and call it not a big deal. After all, you were raised to believe that needing warmth was excessive, selfish, even shameful. Neurologically, this pattern has roots. Studies in attachment theory and developmental psychology show that repeated emotional absence reshapes how the brain regulates emotion, threat perception, and connection. The neglected child becomes the hyper-independent adult. Autonomy is no longer a choice, it's a defense. And connection, that feels like a risk. You tell yourself, I don't need anyone. But late at night, when the distractions die down, you feel the ache, and you don't know what it's asking for. Cognitive distortions also take hold. You may believe, I shouldn't burden others. If I express emotion, I'll be judged. People leave when I'm vulnerable. These aren't flaws in your thinking, they are adaptations formed during the years when expressing emotion got you silence, confusion, or shame. The child doesn't blame the parent, they blame themselves. Even success can become a prison. You may achieve, impress, and build, but not from joy, from desperation, a hunger to be seen, validated, chosen. Alain de Botton speaks to this when he says, we may be so good at taking care of ourselves that we forget to notice how alone we are. Busyness becomes a sedative. Productivity becomes a mask for pain. And then there's the existential consequence, the quiet erosion of meaning. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, reminds us that humans are not driven by pleasure, but by purpose. But how can you find purpose if your entire personality is built on what others needed you to be? The emotionally neglected adult often wakes up one day, surrounded by a life they built, and realizes none of it feels like theirs. This is not a cry for drama. It is a quiet grief, a grief for the moments of presence that never came, for the person you could have become if someone had simply asked, "What do you feel?" and waited for the answer. This is the cost of emotional neglect. It doesn't ruin your life overnight. It shapes it, from the shadows, subtly, perpetually. You may struggle to make decisions, not because you're indecisive, but because no one taught you that your feelings mattered. You may sabotage intimacy, not because you're broken, but because connection triggers the very vulnerability that was once ignored. You may feel ashamed of your pain, not because it's shameful, but because it was never validated. And if you try to talk about it, people might say, but your parents did their best, you had food, you were safe. Yes, and you were invisible. This is the paradox of emotional neglect. It's not about what happened, it's about what didn't, and how that absence became the architecture of your entire emotional world. But now, you're starting to see the blueprint, and that means you have a choice. Are you ready to tear it down? To rebel against emotional neglect is not to confront your parents with accusations. It is not to relive your pain endlessly in search of validation. It is something far more radical. It is to declare with trembling defiance, I exist, and I matter. This rebellion doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It begins in quiet moments when you pause before over-apologizing, when you ask yourself, what do I want? When you choose to feel something fully instead of dismissing it as silly, inconvenient, or dramatic. You were trained to survive. Now you must learn to be. And it will feel wrong at first, because for the emotionally neglected, self-love doesn't feel good. It feels unfamiliar. Self-trust feels dangerous. Rest feels lazy. Setting boundaries feels cruel. But that discomfort is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's a sign that you're entering the territory of your true self, the one that never got to speak. Alain de Botton, ever the philosophical therapist, once said, "It is the mark of a good life to know where we were hurt and to learn how we tried to survive it." And survival often means performance, adaptation, overfunctioning, people-pleasing, withdrawal. But now awareness has entered, and awareness is the first act of rebellion. Here's a dangerous idea. What if you stopped trying to be easy to love? What if you stopped editing your emotions to keep the peace? What if you allowed yourself to want things just because you want them? This is not narcissism. It is the restoration of agency. The neglected child was never asked, what do you need? So the adult must ask it now and answer without shame. Carl Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Emotional neglect becomes fate only when it goes unexamined. The moment you name it, you interrupt the pattern, you expose the script, and when you see the script, you can write something new. This is where shadow work comes in, not as a trendy concept, but as a sacred excavation. The parts of you that learn to disappear need not be healed, they need to be welcomed. Your neediness, your anger, your longing, your hunger for recognition. These are not flaws, they are signposts. They point toward the self that remembers it was once abandoned and has chosen to return. There are practical steps, yes. Journaling as a way to reconnect with disowned emotions. Therapy not to be fixed, but to be found. Boundaries not as walls, but as declarations of self-respect. Reparenting practices that ask, what would I say to the child I once was? But more than any technique, this is a spiritual rebellion. Because to reclaim your right to exist emotionally is to challenge a society that rewards numbness, overwork, and stoic detachment. It is to say, I don't want to be efficient, I want to be whole. This will cost you. People may call you selfish, dramatic, sensitive, and maybe you are. Maybe that's your superpower. The emotionally neglected are often the most empathic, the most perceptive, the most attuned to others, because they had to be. But now you must turn that sensitivity inward, toward yourself. You will falter. You will second guess. But every time you choose to honor your own experience, you reclaim a piece of your soul. And piece by piece, the self that was hidden behind survival begins to emerge, not perfectly, but truthfully. This is not a return to who you were before the wound. It is a becoming that says, I am not what was done to me, I am what I choose to become in spite of it. And that choice, that act of becoming, it is the rebellion the world never saw coming. What if the person you're trying so hard to become is just another mask? What if healing from emotional neglect isn't about becoming more functional, more productive, more emotionally intelligent, but about realizing you were never broken to begin with? This is the paradox at the center of emotional recovery. The true self is not something you create, it is something you remember. Not a performance, not a persona, but a quiet return to the child who once looked around the room, heart open, eyes wide, and simply asked, "Can anyone see me?" And no one did. So you learned to disappear, to please, to perform, to cope. But that original self, the one who longed for connection, for safety, for being known, that self never left. It was simply waiting, waiting for you to become the parent you never had, waiting for you to stop looking outward for permission and to turn inward with reverence. This is the moment of awakening, when you realize that the pain you've been carrying is not a sign of weakness, but a memory of your capacity to feel deeply, to love deeply, to long deeply. And the truth is, your sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was that no one knew how to hold it. Alain de Botton says, "Maturity begins when we finally forgive our parents, not out of denial, but because we understand the limitations of their emotional vocabulary." Forgiveness in this context is not absolution, it is release. Release from the fantasy that you'll ever get the apology that makes it all make sense. Release from waiting for someone else to finally validate your inner child. And most of all, release from the belief that your pain disqualifies you from love. Because here's the most radical realization of all: you were always lovable, even in your most chaotic, needy, confused moments, especially then. But love to a neglected child often felt like a performance. So as an adult, you may find yourself endlessly auditioning for friends, partners, even therapists, trying to earn what should have been given freely. But love is not earned. Love is allowed. And now, as terrifying as it may seem, it's time to allow it, not just from others, but from yourself. That means letting yourself cry over things you were told to get over. It means creating a life that reflects who you are, not who you had to become. You may never fully stop flinching when someone gets too close. You may always have a trace of doubt when you ask for what you need. But every time you choose to stay with yourself, with the discomfort, with the messy truth, you reclaim the very self that was once lost. And here's the secret most never discover. Healing isn't about becoming better, it's about becoming real. The kind of real that no longer needs to impress. The kind of real that no longer confuses silence with safety. The kind of real that stands, even when the past whispers you don't matter. Because now, you answer back. You matter, not because of what you produce, or how well you please, or how perfectly you perform, but because you exist. And that finally is enough. Some wounds leave no bruises, only echoes. But if you've made it this far, if you've dared to peer into the quiet ache left by emotional neglect, then know this: you are no longer invisible. Not to yourself. The journey of healing isn't marked by fireworks or milestones. It's marked by tiny, defiant moments of awareness, a breath taken before self-betrayal, a feeling named before it's buried. A truth spoken even when your voice shakes. These are not small things. These are revolutions. You are not obligated to become what your parents could understand. You are not required to carry their emotional vocabulary as your own. You can speak a new language, one of honesty, presence, and radical compassion. There will be relapses into silence, into shame, into the performance of fine. That's okay. What matters is not perfection, but return. Return to yourself again and again. One day, perhaps not far from now, you will look in the mirror, not for flaws to fix, not for a mask to wear, but for signs of life. And you will see someone who survived absence by becoming presence. Not because someone finally saw you, but because you did. And maybe, just maybe, that was the love you were always waiting for. If this message stirred something inside you, if you saw yourself in these words, then don't let the insight fade back into the noise. Subscribe for more videos that dive beneath the surface, exploring the psychology, philosophy, and truth behind the self you're still becoming. Leave a comment and tell us, what part of yourself have you been hiding? Your story might be the mirror someone else needs to finally see themselves. And remember, you are not too much, you are not too late, you are not broken, you are awakening.